Thank you, Luis. And today's speech is brought to you by Tiny Marketing. So if you're tired of sending out proposals and getting crickets, it's time to do things differently. A gateway offer does the job of a proposal while getting you paid. Learn how to launch and sell a gateway offer that easily upsells your clients to your signature offer without endless sales calls and ghosted proposals. Go to tinymarketing.com and use the code BrandersFest to get the gateway offer challenge for $9 as opposed to the normal $47. Now I want to introduce Rob Meyerson from Heirloom. Oh, Rob is a branding just icon these days, and his latest books have been everywhere, including designing brand identities with the late great Alina Wheeler, as well as brand naming, which Rob has, which I actually have right behind me, but you can't see because of a virtual background. Hi, Rob. Good morning. How are you, sir?
Good morning. I'm great. Thanks for having me, Stephen.
I'm so happy you are here. Well, the floor is yours. Feel free to share your presentation. Today, Rob's going to take us through the brand plan. We're going to go for about, 40 minutes, 45 minutes or so. Then we'll open up to Q&A. And then we'll take it from there. But again, we're just so excited to have Rob kicking off the week. BrandersFest 2024 is in progress. Mr. Meyerson, take it away.
Thanks again, Stephen, and thanks to Branders and Luis and everybody at Branders Magazine for having me and for creating this great event. I'm honored to be here and honored to be kicking it off with this talk. So I'm going to give sort of an overview of the branding process. It's in order to do that in about 40 minutes, of course, we have to do it at a pretty high level. And so for those of you who are very experienced at building brands, managing brands, there may not be a lot of surprises in here because you know the process. But what I want to do is just give some tips, some pointers, some things to remember that I think it's useful for all of us. Those of us who do build brands on a regular basis, we've done this so many times that sometimes it's good to take a step back and think about what are the things that we might be glossing over, places where we might be cutting corners that really we shouldn't be. And so I want to give you some of those reminders as well, things to just stay focused on as you go through the process of building a new brand or refreshing a brand that's been around for a while. So let's dive in. First, a little intro. Stephen, thanks for your intro of me. He mentioned these books. I run Heirloom, so that's the logo you see there on that coffee mug, which I'm also coincidentally drinking from right now. It's our just a full service brand strategy and identity agency. Excuse me. So Heirloom, we do naming, which is kind of a specialty of mine. We do brand architecture, brand positioning. We do visual identity design. Naming, because it is an area of focus for me. That's also the book that I wrote that you can see the corner of there, the blue one, came out 3 years ago. And then most recently partnered with the late, great Alina Wheeler, who sadly passed away last year. But she created this book 20 years ago, Designing Brand Identity, now in its sixth edition. She created it. She did 5 editions completely on her own, and then for the sixth, she asked me if I would be her co-author on it, and so I did that. And we revised that book. It just came out earlier this year with a bunch of new brands in it, a bunch of new thinking, new experts quoted. And so highly encourage you, even if you have an old edition, to check out the new one and just see what's changed and been updated. And I'm going to talk about some things from that book a little bit today, because the ask here was to look into the branding process. And to be honest, the branding process, it hasn't changed, right? It is the process is the process. And so I actually went into that Designing Brand Identity book. And even if you go back to 2003, when the first edition came out, it's that same 5-step process that Alina documented. And so, why reinvent the wheel, right? If it's working, let's stick with it. And so those 5 steps are conducting research, clarifying strategy, designing identity, creating touch points based on that identity, and then managing assets over time. Just once the brand is out in the world, of course, that's when the real work begins of just building that brand over time, right? So, we could end the presentation here, right? Here's the process, end of talk. But I wanted to dig a little deeper and I wanted to do a couple of things. One is that process, like I said, it came out of the book in the middle, but I looked in a couple other places. And so we have these other great books and obviously countless blog posts that all document what is the branding process. And so I wanted to do a little bit of checking. So the book on the left by David Airy just came out earlier this year, I think. I have it behind me, called The Process. So what better place to look? And then many of you may know the brilliant Michael Johnson out of the UK who runs Johnson Banks and he's written a couple of great branding books, but Branding in 5.5 Steps, I thought, let's look at those steps and see if there's overlap. And so if we look at Michael's book first, he has these 5 steps in the table of contents. And lo and behold, he uses different terminology, which we can talk about, but it's the same steps. Conducting research, he calls it investigation. Clarifying strategy, he calls it strategy and narrative. So he's very big on one of my favorite things, what you might call verbal identity. What are the words that we use? So even though he's a designer and he's written a lot of this is really for designers, the book that Alina and I put out has design in the title, but so much of building a strong brand, even if you're thinking about the visuals, it's also about the words that we associate with those visuals. And so that's a big part of his book. Step 3 is design. Step 4, he calls implement, but really it's about bringing that brand to life across all of the touch points, all of the places that the brand touches the customer, metaphorically speaking. And then lastly, he says engage or revive. I'd say that's basically managing the brand, managing the assets over time. Now he, as the title suggests, has this funny little step in the middle, 2.5. And again, because he's so big on the verbal part, he's encouraging readers to go back and forth between steps 2 and 3, to blur the lines between those 2 steps and to think about how the words and visuals can interact with each other. Some of the best identity work he's done, and this is, in his own words, has been when they've thought about how to express the brand verbally, and sometimes that'll spark an idea for the visuals. So he doesn't want it to be too linear and stepwise. He wants you to allow yourself to go back and forth. And I think that's a really good lesson from this book. Even though I've shown 5 steps, that's not to necessarily say you have to do one and then finish it, go to the next one and then finish it and never go back. A lot of this happens in a nonlinear fashion where you're kind of going back and forth. You're realizing you need to do more research as you get into step 4. And so you go back and do a little more step 1. So I think that's a really important idea that Michael added in his book. And then if we look at the table of contents in David's book, The Process, brilliant book that just came out this year. And he has another great book just called ID or Identity Designed. He has 4 steps: research, strategy, design, and he calls it implementation, just like Michael does. So he doesn't have that 5th step, and that's because this book is really about creating the identity. So he doesn't get into that 5th step as much about managing it over time, but obviously it's the same idea, the same process. And so feeling pretty confident here that this 5-step process that's been around for at least 20 years, if not far more, is the best way to think about the process of building a brand and then managing a brand over time. So here it is again. But what I want to do today is go into each step one at a time. And we're not going to go super deep because we don't have time and it would get into the weeds too much. But just a couple of pointers on each step and things to bear in mind. And we'll go a little deeper on the first 3 and then kind of a light touch on 4 and 5. So let's talk about conducting research. Phase 1. My first tip here is to do it. And I do think that there are a lot of consultants, a lot of designers, a lot of entrepreneurs, founders who maybe don't entirely skip this, but really gloss over the research step. You think, oh, I have an idea for a company, for a brand, for a product. I just want to put up a website, start building it. I have an idea for the name, for the logo. I'm just going to create it and like hit go. And I love that energy, right? That all of us entrepreneurs have. Like the ideas are just pinging and you want to go, go, go. But I would strongly encourage you to take a breath, take a step back, survey the market, do these things that you should do, right? But sometimes it's hard to take that pause and do it. So the other thing is don't let it intimidate you. I think a lot of people hear research And part of the reason they don't do it is they think, oh God, I'm going to be bogged down in survey data or focus groups. Sounds super boring. Yes, I mean, parts of research can be dry, but it doesn't have to be this lengthy, heavy process. Research can be calling up 5 customers and having conversations with them, take them out for coffee. That's research too, right? So there are ways to do it that can be less intimidating and more fun. Now I said, don't let it intimidate you. And now I'm showing this ugly graphic from a McKinsey business consultant, but bear with me for a second. I like to go back into history and make sure, like I did with, this 20-year-old process I'm showing, make sure that we're building on solid foundations. So this idea comes from, I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce it right, but Konichi Omai. He was a McKinsey strategist. He wrote an incredible book, although pretty heavy stuff, The Mind of the Strategist. And he introduced this idea of what we now call the 3 Cs. And so I find this graphic super intimidating and confusing, but we can simplify it like this. Just take those 3 circles: customers, corporation, and competitors. And that's one way. There are other C words you can use in there. You could say clients, you could say consumers. For corporation, you could say, if you're a consultant, you could say your client, you could say just the company. Anyway, it works. It's those same 3 Cs. And that's what you want to conduct your research on. You want to understand these 3 groups as best you can. And so questions you want to ask or get answered during research, or what's true about our company or our brand? What are the strengths? The why question, why are we creating this brand? Why do we exist? These are the types of questions you want to try to find out. And so you could just interview the founders, or if you are the founder, you could just sit and think and write down, why am I doing this? Sure, I want to build a company and make money and all those things, but is there, some reason that you felt compelled to do this that might be a really inspiring story that you could tell when you build the brand, and you start to source that material here in the research phase. Customers, who are they? What are they looking for? What might make us more relevant or appealing to them? Let's think about their lives and where our product or our company or our brand fits in. Is there some unmet need? Is the reason we're creating this because there's some product that we always wished we could have and nobody else created it, and that's why we did it. And so is there that unmet need in the marketplace that we can fill? And then competitors, let's look. I mean, this is one that I think, unfortunately, a lot of founders do kind of skip or gloss over, is doing that deep research on what else is out there already. Even if it's not a direct competitor, how are customers doing what we want to help them do now? Or is there some other product or brand or company that's sort of filling that need in their lives? And if so, what makes us different than them? What makes us better than them? Now, the way that you do that, I talked about this a little bit, but it's like unlimited the number of things you could do. So for finding out about the company, you could look at the business strategy. You could look at, if it's an existing brand, old communications. You could interview the leaders at the company or yourselves or your colleagues. You could survey your employees. And I won't go into all the others, but yes, there are surveys. There is social media analysis. There are audits you can do. My takeaway here is to not have a set punch list of things that you think you have to do in order to be doing research correctly, but to tailor it to the situation. So, think about, are you creating something new, or are you refreshing something that's been around? Is it B2B? Is it B2C? All of these questions are going to help you determine the right kind of research. And ultimately, you need to figure out what makes sense in order to get these types of questions answered. Whatever you do to get these questions answered in an unbiased and clear and complete way is the right kind of research for you and for your brand. So just as an example, this is a totally recent real world example. I'm putting together a marketing plan for Heirloom, my agency, for 2025. And I thought I should do this the right way. I should practice what I preach. And I started reaching out to old clients and saying, hey, can we just sit down on Zoom or in real life and have a chat about Heirloom, what did you like about working with us? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? But as soon as I started reaching out, I realized, you know what? I felt bad reaching out because I thought a lot of these clients, I've already asked them to write a review of our work on this site called Clutch, which you may or may not be familiar with. It's a B2B sort of rating site for companies in all kinds of different spaces, but lots of creative agencies there. And you can go read, you know, what have past clients experienced with them. So I thought, you know what? I've already done this. And it wouldn't be a branding conference without somebody bringing up AI, right? So I thought, let's dump all that information into ChatGPT. So I asked this question: act like you're a market research expert. I'm going to give you 15 to 20 interview transcripts, which I have from Clutch, about a branding agency called Heirloom. The interviewees are Heirloom's clients. Please look for common themes, salient points, strengths, and weaknesses. And of course, it spat out. This is like less than a third of what it spat out. If you've worked with ChatGPT, it is nothing if not verbose, right? It talks a little too much. So common themes, personalized service, boutique feel, strategic and tailored approach. And this is literally when I wanted to do the positioning work for Heirloom. How is Heirloom different from other branding agencies out there? This is not the only thing I did. I think it's important to get cross-reference your research. But this was a huge thing for me to be able to just pull this out of those interviews that had already been done and sort of get this summary of what are our strengths and weaknesses. And yeah, there was a section of like, here are some of the weaknesses and things we need to work on. And so that's really informative as well. So that's something, if you have reviews on, I don't know, it depends what your brand or product is, Amazon, Goodreads, if you're an author, Yelp, if you're a restaurant or some other kind of retail location, you might be able to dump those into an AI tool and get a really nice analysis like this. So tailor it to the situation, and that's what I did here. All right, let's talk about strategy. I should mention there will be time at the end of this for Q&A. So as we're going through, if you have questions, please jot them down and you can ask me, ask Stephen at the end. All right, strategy. So we had those 3 C's. What are we looking for to build our strategy? We're looking for sort of an overlap between those 3 C's. So if we can find answers that kind of match in all 3 of these circles, we'll find ideas that are authentic, right? We did our research on ourselves, on our company and our brand. So we know that we're going to talk about things that are true, things that people believe to be true about our brand or could believe to be true about our brand. Things that are distinctive because we looked at competitors. So we know that we're not just saying exactly the same thing that everybody else out there is saying in exactly the same way. And then resonant or compelling, things that customers care about, because you could fill 2 of these circles and then not the third, and that wouldn't work too well, right? You could say something that is true and totally unique, but that none of your customers want or care about. You could say things that are true and your customers want, but that everybody else is saying. And so who cares? It's just going to wash over them. So you really need to find ideas that successfully achieve all 3 things here that are authentic, distinctive, and resonant. Sometimes you hear credible, relevant, and differentiating. Different ways of saying the same things, but we're looking for ideas that hit that overlap spot. And you don't want too many of them, right? There's this great proverb. I love it. If you chase 2 rabbits, both will escape. So the idea that if you're hunting, and if you were literally trying to run after your prey and you saw 2 rabbits and you tried to catch both of them at once and they split up, you're done, right? You've missed both of them. You got to find one idea that you can really own. And if you look at some of the best brands out there, I'm guessing that when you look at these logos and think of these names and think of experiences with these brands, either real life experiences you've had or just communications from them, ads that you've seen from these brands, all of us, even though we all come from different backgrounds, have different experiences, we all have similar words that sort of pop into our heads if we had to sort of stick adjectives to these brands. What are they all about? What is the vibe? What is the the brand experience that you get from these. And so, maybe we don't have literally the same words as what's up here, but the same ideas, right? IBM's known for being smart. Nike's all about winning. Uh, Toyota is known for reliability. Volvo, one of the best examples of really owning an idea. And they don't even have the safest cars anymore, right? But they're still known after decades of building that reputation for this idea of safety. And the way that you do that, is first off, you be a brand that's super successful, a business that's super successful for over 100 years in some cases. But you stay on message, right? You have one idea. You don't chase a bunch of different rabbits. And so advice here for strategy is to chase one or at least very few rabbits, right? Some of these brands can get away with a couple of ideas. Like I had indulgence there for Starbucks. The first thing that comes up for Starbucks for me is just coffee. That's an idea that they can own and a very tangible, practical idea. But they also have this more emotional, abstract idea of just indulge, just something when you want to treat yourself, you go to Starbucks and get a coffee or something else. The other idea here is to not get too hung up on the frameworks. We all use these. I have a framework that I use. Most agencies, if you Google brand framework, which is exactly what I did to get this image, this is not an image, by the way, that I'm endorsing or recommending. It's literally just Google brand frameworks and 100 things come up. And so I grabbed this one from a site called creately.com just to show you, yeah, there are all these ideas, these different terms, personality, positioning, benefits, attributes. Not to say they aren't important, but it's less about filling in the boxes in some framework. I think sometimes as strategists or entrepreneurs, we download something like this or we get trained on something like this and we get emphasized, we overemphasize the importance of just populating the strategy framework, but that's less important than the ideas. And again, I said at the top, like this is stuff that we all know, but I think is helpful to just remind ourselves what we need to focus on is really the right ideas and expressing them really clearly. And frankly, sometimes the frameworks work against that, right? If we have a vision and a positioning, sometimes there's like a blurry line and we're not sure which is which, or they sound the same and it's just distracting. What I want you to focus on is just what are the ideas that you can own that sit at the overlap of those three circles, and how can you express them in a way that's just crystal clear? Like I think a lot of people that when they start in branding, they're really idealistic and they want everything to sound really romantic and compelling. And yeah, that's great. I mean, we're all in creative services here. We're building brands. And so we want everything to sound like, an ad that Steve Jobs would have signed off on, that just makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. And yes, I love that stuff too. And there's a time and a place for it. But if you're really doing strategy work, this is the time and place for just really clear, crystal clear, brass tacks, just what are we all about? And let the next few phases 3, 4, and 5, be about that creativity and romance and sort of flowery language to make it sing. All right, so that's step 2. Step 3, designing identity. I should say, this process, it's hard, it's impossible, I think, to have a 5-step process that's going to apply to every branding situation. Sometimes you're not doing design work, you're repositioning a brand, you're renaming a brand, and the design work is not really the centerpiece. So in our book, for example, designing, we're using that term pretty loosely. Designing could be creating a name. It could be not a logo, but maybe just like redoing a website or something like that. But let's talk about design as design for our purposes today. I went and just, I'm not a designer. So I always defer to the great designers out there. And so I like looking up, what are the greatest brand identities of all time? And, I don't think we're going to do live Q&A during the talk here, but I'm wondering if you ask yourself, what is it that's similar about some of these greatest logos of all time? And these are just the logos. A couple things come to mind. They're all pretty simple. They've survived for a long time. And I think a lot of that is because they didn't chase trends. some of these I should say haven't quite survived, right? AT&T has changed, UPS has changed, um, but they've retained some of the thinking from these original. The other thing that these logos have in common, believe it or not, there's, what is there, 16 here? I think, no, more than that. Yeah, 24, sorry, doing math on the fly. All of them are by 4 different designers or design agencies. Upper left is Saul Bass, upper right is Paul Rand, 2 of the greatest logo and visual identity, corporate identity designers of all time. Bottom row is by 2 of the greatest agencies of all time, Shermaya from Geismar and Landor. Both still exist, different sort of people, obviously, at those agencies and different work being done now, but these are classic identities designed by these agencies. So I find it amazing to look at some of these, greatest logos of all time and to realize that you could probably pick these 4 and maybe another 4 and cover 90% of some of the greatest work out there. Pentagram does great work. There are a handful of other designers that you could pick from. And what I think they get, just to boil it down, and this is also from reading interviews from these designers and listening to podcasts where they talk about how they do what they do, it's really 3 ideas. I mentioned one of them already, which is just simplicity, really strive for simplicity. In fact, Chermayeff, who passed away a couple of years ago, has a great quote about, the best logos should look like they took 5 minutes, even though they actually took 6 months to design. If you look at some of these, like Showtime down at the bottom, or even, ABC, it's like, a lot of people, non-designers especially, look at these and just think, oh, I could have done that. It's simple. And yeah, it is really simple, but I guarantee you there were hundreds of ideas that fed into that. And to get to that level of simplicity is actually quite a bit harder than you would think. And if you look at some of the worst logos out there, a lot of times it's because they're just too complicated, trying too hard, lots of gradients and swooshes and different stuff happening, and it becomes a mess. And so that also can work against memorability, right? The simplest logos are also more memorable. You actually want something that somebody could freehand draw themselves. That can actually make it more memorable. And then lastly, adaptable, which again, simplicity plays into this. We're going to talk about touch points next. So a simple way to say this is you want something that you could embroider on a hat, that you could engrave on a glass, that you could see from 20 feet across a room and recognize, because it's that simple and that adaptable. It can be big, it can be small, it can be done in different ways, and it works equally well. And also, if you pivot, to use the Silicon Valley term, if all of a sudden you're selling pasta instead of pizza as a restaurant, you probably don't want a big pizza in your logo, right? And so there is this idea of being a little more abstract and being able to then shift gears, shift into different industries, or just grow and expand and adapt over time. So those are 3 things I would leave you with when you think about logos and visual identities more broadly. And that's the other piece of this, is to not be too focused on the logo, which I realize I just talked about logos, but there are other parts to the system, right? So this, again, from our most recent version of designing brand identity, think about color. You can recognize, and here's another Q&A that we're not going to do. Ask yourself how many of these brands you can recognize without even seeing the logo. So obviously Adidas in the upper left with the logo, but you can probably recognize those brown trucks. Even if you don't speak Chinese and have never been to China, you probably can guess what that is the Chinese logo for in the upper right, just based on the typography with the Chinese characters resembling the typography used in English. You may not know the brand in the lower left there, but if you do, it's very recognizable just based on that imagery style, that color palette. And so that, I'll just tell you, that is Headspace. It's an app you can download for meditation, for all kinds of mental health related things. And so their imagery is very relaxing and positive, and it gives you the vibes that they want you to get from their brand. If you're into luxury goods at all, you recognize that pattern at the bottom. And you don't have to be a luxury brand to have a recognizable pattern. Lots of, um, Adidas has the three stripes. They use three stripes on the ceiling of their retail stores sometimes. So not a luxury brand per se, but they still have a pattern. And then iconography, that's Google in the lower right. So, even if you don't know, which I don't know what some of those apps are, I probably could have guessed that it was Google because of the colors, because of the way they create very consistent looking icons. And so the great designers do this instinctively. Well, maybe not instinctively, they've been trained to do this, and you should train yourself to do this too. Always think beyond the logo, think about the full system and how it's going to work together and how people are going to recognize your brand, even if they haven't seen the logo, just based on color, typography, patterns, imagery, icons. All right, we'll go a little less deep on these last two, because really creating touch points is kind of, we could give a whole talk on this, right? Because it's unlimited. And so this graphic, which we update every edition in designing brand identity, because we have to add something to it. We've got podcasts in here. We've got things like augmented reality in the book now. It's really all of these places that your brand then needs to come to life, right? It's a lot of them are visual, but some of them are not. Like support. How do your if people call you and need customer support for your product, or if they have a complaint, what is that experience like, and how does that bring the brand to life? How does it bring the ideas that we came up with in step 2 to the fore? If you're writing blog posts, they should feel like your brand. Everything that we do. And just a few that I want to kind of highlight here, because maybe they don't get as much attention. One is characters. And we have two consumer brands here that you're maybe familiar with, Pillsbury, of course, the famous Doughboy, and then Geico, which if you're outside the US, you might not be as familiar with. I put this here because there is some relatively recent research suggesting that characters are actually really, really memorable for brands, and a lot of brands don't use them. But even in B2B and in some really unexpected places, you will see characters. So Salesforce, for example, has a whole set of characters. They have one called Astro, which is kind of the main character, but that's a B2B software brand. And yet they've been able to do this. And if you don't know it, it might be because you're not in their target audience, but their customers know it. And so it might not be right for every brand, but I'd encourage you to at least think about, could this be something that would help make my brand more memorable and give it more personality? Scent, right? Again, not right for every brand. Salesforce doesn't have a scent as far as I know. But if you have retail locations, if you are in hospitality, if you're a restaurant, there may be opportunities to create scent. And scent is something that, neuroscientists tell us that we remember scents really well, sometimes better than visuals and things that we hear. And so there is a real benefit to being able to create a custom scent. This is one that was created for Harrods, the department store in the UK. So another one that is often overlooked, signage, something that could be overlooked. And all of these are examples that are in Designing Brand Identity. It was nice for me to be able to just go and pull them from that book. So this is signage for a bridge, but created by a branding agency, and so very much on theme. The color matches the color of the actual bridge that you walk across. It's all in the consistent typography, consistent color palette, consistent shapes and icons. But signage that you use on your retail stores, but even in your headquarters, even for conference rooms, you can have that consistency and bring that brand to life everywhere and just make people feel like they are immersed in the brand. They may not even be consciously aware of it, but there are still benefits to creating that really consistent feel. Think about Steve Jobs and how he insisted that the Apple Store feel like, I think this was his brief, it feels like you're walking into an iPod, right? Like it's clean, it's white, and there's lots of space. That's the feeling of Apple, even though it's just a store. It's not a product, which is what they're known for. And related to that is branded environments. This is a restaurant in, I think, Australia, a Japanese restaurant in Australia that, I mean, just they try to make it feel like you're in, I think, like downtown Tokyo or some other city in Japan. And so they have these signs hanging from the ceiling that just feel very like you're walking through a city, and talk about creating uh, just a memorable experience for just a dining experience. So think creatively about all of these different touch points and how you can bring the brand to life. And just, I would encourage you, just go beyond the expected. You don't have to do all of these, characters, scents might not be right for your brand, but don't stick with your checklist of logo, website, social media profiles, and business cards. Like, yeah, get the basics right. I don't know if anyone does business cards anymore. Get the basics right, but then think about, should we create a podcast? And if so, how can we make it sound like our brand? That's another thing that's overlooked a lot, is sonic branding. Having a unique music or a sonic logo like Intel has, so that people recognize it when they hear it. So just push yourself a little bit to think and go beyond the expected. And then lastly, managing assets, which, this is where a lot of the work happens, because those first four steps you might only do once. You might build your brand and then just let that ride for, in some cases, like we saw, hundreds of years, for some of these really successful brands, if you're lucky. But there could be a whole talk just about, our whole MBA, just about managing brands. So we're not going to do all of it, just going to talk about a few things. I mentioned brands that have been around 100 years. So let's talk about Pepsi and Coca-Cola. You've probably seen, maybe you've seen this graphic. I pulled it from Flowing Data. And also there's a version done by Brand New, which is a great branding blog. I encourage you to check out, a brand identity review site. The point here is that consistency works. And this is kind of like a meme that went around, I don't know, 10 plus years ago. It's actually inaccurate, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the point that the creator was trying to make, sort of snarky comment here about, Coca-Cola is a stronger brand than Pepsi. I think we'd all agree. And I think all the brand measurements kind of bear that out. And the implication here is that maybe it's partly because Coca-Cola has just stuck to the Coca-Cola logo and identity very consistently for well over 100 years now, whereas Pepsi seems to feel the need to reinvent itself every 10-ish years. And in fact, we know that they've done it even again more recently. That's the idea here. The reason I wanted to get Brand New's version in here is because they actually went and did a bunch of research and got a more accurate version here. And it turns out that Coca-Cola is not quite as consistent as that would have you think. They originally did not have the script. They didn't create that until a few years into the business. That script, was hand drawn by, I think, their bookkeeper. And of course, it's been refined and refined to sort of perfection, which maybe happened around the 40s. And then they've sort of changed it in terms of different holding devices. In the 80s, of course, there was New Coke. If any of the rest of you lived through that, I feel sorry for you for having experienced New Coke. I definitely have bad memories of it. So it hasn't been perfectly consistent, but yes, pretty consistent compared to Pepsi. And Pepsi, of course, is even, this was an old graphic now. More recently, they sort of redesigned again and even went a little retro. Their current logo looks a little bit more like their logo from the 60s and 70s. But the idea here is that there is some strength and consistency, right? And there's data that backs this up. If you look to this Ehrenberg Bass Institute, which you might have heard of, it's an Australian sort of brand and marketing think tank, for lack of a better word. That if you've heard of How Brands Grow, the author Byron Sharp is at Ehrenberg Bass Institute. So is his co-author, Jenny Romaniuk, who's quoted here. And she says, when assets have been embedded for a while, it's tempting to tinker with them. Don't. Fight the natural urge to change your distinctive assets. And that term, distinctive brand assets, comes out of Ehrenberg Bass Institute. And it's hard to look at Pepsi and not feel like maybe part of the reason they changed so much is because they got tempted to just tinker. They got bored. A new CMO came in and said, let's redo the logo. Like, we got to catch up to Coke. Whereas maybe Coke has always been number one. And so they feel less pressure and they're just like, let's, if it ain't broke, let's not fix it. As a business owner myself, I know that it is tempting. Like, we got to redo the website. Maybe we should change our color palette. Like, our logo's boring. I've been looking at it for 10 years. Fight that urge. Your customers are not bored of your brand assets. To be perfectly blunt, they probably don't even recognize them yet. It takes a long time for your brand assets, your logo, your color palette, your typography, all these things we've talked about, to get embedded into your customers' minds. Let it ride, stay consistent. That said, there is room for creativity and flexibility. So one of the things we don't see on that last slide is that Coca-Cola confidently plays with its brand assets a lot. And so to grow and evolve over time, you have to give yourself a little room to play. And this is where you have to be strategic about managing your brand. This is Turner Duckworth's work. Happy to be sharing their work, given that they're going to be part of this conference. They do brilliant work like this a lot, actually, with brands that have been around for as long or almost as long as Coca-Cola. They're one of these agencies that I think is brilliant at figuring out how can we be smart about playing with those brand assets in a way that doesn't damage them, doesn't weaken their ability to be instantly recognizable, but that gives the brand new life. So everything on this slide, I can hear people inside Coca-Cola saying, we can't do that. We can't take the Coca-Cola logo and put it inside sunglasses so that you've cut off part of a logo. You can't see the whole word. That's got to be against brand guidelines, right? On the can there, it's like partly in red, partly in white. I'm sure there's guidelines somewhere, or there were in the past, that said never do that. Using the bottle as a silhouette instead of, as inside the 100, the way it's kind of carving things up. And this, by the way, all this work was done for the 100th anniversary of Coca-Cola. So we create guidelines for brands, and there's always do's and don'ts in there. And the don'ts often say, don't do things like this. And that's all good and well, because to build a strong brand, you do have to be consistent. But once you've built some of that equity and you have some of that strength that you could fall back on, you have to allow yourself to play around a little bit. And that is a lot of where brand management comes in, is how can we do that in a way that's going to build the brand and not damage it? And there's no universal answer to that. That is where you do your research, to go back to step one, and figure out where can we play and where should we avoid playing. So balance, coherence, or consistency, and flexibility is my tip on step 5. So here's our 5-step process. Here's our tips. So just to review, for conducting research, make sure you do it and tailor it to your situation. For strategy, stay focused, chase one or very few rabbits. Think more about the ideas and expressing them clearly than about the frameworks. For design, keep it simple, memorable, and adaptable, and think in systems, not just logos. Go beyond the expected when you're creating touch points. Push yourself, create things that are not just your standard 10 things on the checklist. And then when you're managing your assets, consistency, then allow yourself to play and be a little flexible and creative with it. So that's it. Thank you very much. Please do come say hi at heirloomagency.com. I also have a blog and a podcast called How Brands Are Built that I'd encourage you to check out. And I'm on the socials. Please do come find me. And if you want to link on LinkedIn or anything, please mention that you heard this talk, and that way I'll know where you're coming from, which is great for my marketing attribution, right? Just so I know
That's right,
where you came from.
Attribution. Rob Meyerson from Heirloom and How Brands Are Built, everyone. Rob, I have so many notes, and we're going to get to some questions in a little bit, but I'm just going to roll down my notes like a comedian trying jokes for the first time. Number one, I love the idea of steps 2.5, right? Because we're constantly it's not a linear process. It's extremely chaotic if you think about it. Six Sigma has no idea about how we're able to think about things. But like, I love that idea of 2.5. I love how you said, thinking beyond the logo and about the full system. And it's funny because as you were showing the Coca-Cola work from Turner Duckworth, they're thinking about the system in such unique ways that really is able to add quality extensions. I love how you brought up sonic branding. I think in the age of TikTok and there's the virality of just audio. That's so important. I scribbled here, bad memories of New Coke, question mark. You seem pretty passionate about really not liking New Coke.
I mean, do you remember? You're old enough. You remember tasting New Coke? It was, oh God, they
Yeah,
just.
no, it was not good.
I mean, clear Pepsi is the only thing that was worth.
Right, exactly. Clear Pepsi. And then the final thing, and I wanted to end on this one, is like build the brand and don't damage it. Like that is such a simple and brilliant way to just summarize everything. So we had a bunch of questions come in, and one of the ones that I just want to bring up first is, what advice would you give to a founder or a small business owner who already runs a business but wants to reinvent himself and wants to create a brand? So they have a business, but it's not a brand yet. How do you make that leap?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, this word brand is so confusing, like the way different ways people use it. I would say, and I can't take credit, I've heard other people say this, you have a brand whether you want to or think you do or not, right? Your brand is whatever your business is now. What is it called? What does it look like? And as long as you have some customers who have you in their mind, whatever that, whatever they think about you, that basically is your brand image. And so what I think you're talking about is how do you strengthen and refresh that? And
Yeah,
so it's the process. You have a leg up in that whatever you're doing has been working to some extent to date, right? I mean, otherwise you'd be out of business. Uh,
right.
and so start with the research. I think a great place to start is go talk to your existing or past customers, like I did with that AI thing with Clutch, and just ask them, what did you like or what did you not like?
Yeah,
Why did you buy from me? Would you buy from me again? And if so, yes, why or why not? Start writing those ideas down, and that's going to form the foundation of your strategy. To go through the rest of those 5 steps, I think you have to think about something I didn't really mention, which is just like, how are you going to get all this done? Are you going to do it all yourself? Which many of
right.
entrepreneurs were very tempted to do, both because we want stranglehold control on everything, but also because sometimes we're cheap and we don't want to, shell out the cash. But do think about agencies. Not every agency is going to break the piggy bank necessarily. There are
Agency isn't a four-letter word.
yeah, lots of freelancers out there these days looking for work. Some of them are brilliant and came out of these agencies, and so you can get that quality of work, but from an individual, and you're going to pay less.
Yeah,
Um, so be strategic about that too. Maybe you can do a lot of the research yourself, but then when it gets into the strategy or the design work, you want to go find someone who knows what they're doing.
yeah,
And so yeah, that's how I would get started.
absolutely. It's as entrepreneurs, it's hard to read the label when you're stuck inside the jar.
Yep.
It's incredibly. I'm just full of these useless one-liners. Chloe has a great question. This is a really good question. How do you find the balance between being creative and adhering to brand guidelines? Is there a line you would draw?
Yeah, yes, but it
Yeah.
depends. This is the unfortunate answer. And it depends on so many things. But I would say, as a general rule, when you're first starting out, be really, really consistent. Bang that logo like a drum. Just use it over and over and over and over again. Give yourself at least a few years of just making sure people have seen your visual identity, have felt your brand experience in a consistent way before you start mixing things up.
Yeah.
Um, I generally, unless you feel like, oh, something's not working and we need to revise it. But I do feel like that temptation quote that I had from Jenny Romaniuk, it's so true. Like you're going to feel like something's not working or feel tempted to tweak something earlier than you should. Um, Once you've built some recognition out there, I mean, there are things you can do. You can do research to figure out how famous your brand assets are, how
Yeah.
recognizable they are, and that'll help you determine what to change and what not to change. Uh, but that's also, I think, once you've built that foundation, that's when you can start playing with things in a really careful way. Um, and then it's just like, well, what's the most recognizable thing? Like Heirloom, just again, as an example, I've changed the typography for Heirloom a number of times already. We've been around for 8 years, 8 or 9 years. Um, it's always been in the same ballpark, but just for sort of like technical reasons, I've changed it. And I think that's not too damaging because it was never like a super recognizable asset. But the logo is exactly the same because that's something that I feel like, it's a really important brand asset and you don't want to be messing with it
Yeah.
too much.
Well, Robin, that actually answers the question we just got in from Bond. Would you recommend a brand agency to have its own logo or to have its own brand? You just answered it, and I'll say even from past experiences, I used to had the branded marketing for a digital experience design agency. We did a lot of physical environments, built environments, and we created mascots. We created an awesome brand, so much so that we were able to sell swag. And then in a dry B2B space, we were like these cool kids. So it is
Yeah.
absolutely, I think, important for agencies to start to brand themselves. All right, I haven't read this one yet. It just came in from Marcelo or Marcello. How do you determine the appropriate amount of time to spend on research and developing a strategic vision, considering that brand research and insights can be an ongoing process throughout the life cycle of a brand? Very smartly put, Marcelo.
Yeah, I mean, and to your point, sometimes you're always researching, right? It's like
Yeah,
always be researching. You can keep that
ABR.
going on in the background. Um, I don't know that there's a right answer for this. I think generally, if you're building like a marketing plan, like I talked about, you want to give yourself at least a quarter before the new year. So start in September for January. But if you're talking about building a new brand, um, I think I'll just say, like, usually working with agencies, you're going to want to have at least a couple of weeks uh,
Yeah,
of research time because a lot of research, honestly, is like chasing people. Like, if you put a survey out, you got to have it out there for a week to get responses. If you're trying to do interviews, you're going to have to spend at least a week just scheduling calls or meetups with people.
yeah,
So give yourself a few weeks at least. I do think, like I'm of two minds, and that's why that first point was do it, but don't be intimidated by it. So you have to do it. Don't skip it, but also don't make it such a beast that you're like, that's why people skip it, I think,
right.
is they think, oh God, I got to keep doing research until I have like this huge volume of research. At some point, there's diminishing returns. Like
Yeah.
I actually just heard somebody say a number, and for me, it's usually like 6 to 8 interviews. You start just hearing the same ideas over and over again. So
Then you start to establish the patterns and the
yeah,
trends.
right.
You got,
You
yeah,
don't have to do 30 interviews with customers, you know. Um, so don't make it such a beast that you're gonna just get overwhelmed. I think is
yeah.
kind of the key there. Spend a few weeks doing it right. And once you feel like you've got those themes and you're starting to hear the same things over and over again, shift gears and move into strategy work.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. Paralysis by analysis, it happens, right? And then next thing you know, we haven't gotten anywhere. So, Rob Meyerson, this has been incredible. We're just at the top of the hour. I want to thank all of our partners who have been able to contribute to make this happen. All right, we got one last question. One last this is the encore from Farouk. I've seen that studios with certain directions, like a mission and a calling. Do you think that's this type of work is sustainable?
Like an agency having its own.
I think that's what the question is. Like we like B Corps or we only work with mission driven organizations, etc.
Yeah, I think it's hard. I think it's really hard. There is evidence out there that it is sustainable. There are a few agencies that sort of almost exclusively work with nonprofits or cause-based, but there's a reason that it's very few. I think it's really, really hard. Um, I would encourage you to not be. I just was talking about this with somebody. Don't get too niche, right? The advice is always niche down, niche down, niche down, but don't be like the agency that only works with like, um, you know, certain type of sport, like combat sports or something like that. It's like
Yeah.
that's great if you have that experience and idea, but if you literally limit yourself to that type of client, it's going to be unsustainable, I think.
And your work is not going to be very differentiated. You're going to start to see a lot of patterns and trends within the work that you put out.
Yeah, I mean, clients don't always see this because I actually just had somebody reach out to me and they wanted an agency with this very niche industry experience. And I was like, I've never worked in that industry, but also why do you want that? Like, everyone in your industry kind of looks the same. I think you should look for somebody who's a generalist that can bring in
Hmm.
thinking. And I do think there's strength in that. So, um, I mean, I love that a lot of agencies are B Corps now. I do think if you can have like a point of view and a few industries that you have deep expertise in, I think that's valuable. But I would just say don't limit yourself so much that you're harming your own opportunities.
Yeah.
It's to quote Olivia Rodrigo, it's brutal out there right now. So like don't harm your business by turning down work that you could do and that could be great.
Well said.
Yeah.
Well said. Thank you, Rob Meyerson. How can just drop your URL one last time?
Yeah, heirloomagency.com. You can find me there. And again, social media, LinkedIn, Instagram, you'll find me there easily.
Awesome. BrandersFest continues tomorrow, 12 p.m. Eastern, with Matt Davies coming over from the UK to join us in the studio to talk about building out the brand strategy. So really building upon the foundation that Rob has just shared today. So check us out, brandersmagazine.com. I am your host, Stephen Picanza. And until tomorrow, peace out.